The question of nuclear weapons in Ukraine still bothers many people. What would happen if Ukraine had nuclear weapons now? Why did we lose it? And so many other questions. In today's talk, we offer to discuss the events that led to Ukraine's abandonment of nuclear weapons. We'll look back into history, and we'll also talk about the consequences of this decision today. Moreover, we will talk about a declassified document that will shed light on the events. Like always, it will be fascinating. The year 1991. The red monster is no longer exists. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a huge nuclear arsenal remains on the territory of Ukraine, the third largest in the world, 17% of the world's potential. No one knew what could happen to this arsenal. Clearly, the West was quite afraid of such uncertainty. After all, in fact, nuclear weapons on the territory of Ukraine did not belong to the country. All control was in Moscow. In other words, Moscovia could launch missiles from Ukraine without our knowledge. And then to say that Ukraine is an independent state that supposedly decided to launch these missiles on its own. We didn't have our own nuclear weapons. It's nonsense that they say that Ukraine had the world's third nuclear potential. Ukraine had Soviet nuclear weapons on its territory, which were managed by Russia, but Ukraine did not have its own nuclear weapons. Yes, overall, it was the third largest arsenal in the world, but it did not belong to Ukraine, explains Professor Volodymyr Vasilenko. Volodymyr Vasilenko, one of the authors of the Declaration of State Sovereignty and the Provision of Non-Nuclear Status, commented on the decision to disarm. In his opinion, at that time, there was a choice between gaining border rights and independence or preserving the nuclear arsenal. In other words, rejection of nuclear weapons was a path to global recognition and independence from the USSR. This is exactly what we have discussed earlier. Formally, Ukraine lost its nuclear status in 1996, although efforts to do so had been underway since the early 1990s. In 1991, Ukraine signed the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and the Budapest Memorandum, thus making a diplomatic crusty and establishing diplomatic ties with Russia and the West. There were those in the Ukrainian government who understood that handing over nuclear weapons to Russia was clearly not a good idea, but the USA offered Ukraine financial assistance in exchange. Just get rejected from nuclear weapons. And during those years, the financial situation in Ukraine was, to put it mildly, difficult. Besides, maintaining nuclear weapons is a very financially expensive business. Interestingly, there are more than one parallel here. Firstly, Ukraine is now also dependent on Western money, and we would like to say a big thank you to the entire civilized world for supporting Ukraine. Secondly, some Western countries are terrified of the collapse of the Russian Federation, arguing that nuclear weapons are spreading throughout the former Russian Federation. Yet, as we have already mentioned, maintaining nuclear weapons is not cheap. We have serious doubts that the conventional Saratov Republic will be eager to spend huge fortunes on this. On top of that, nuclear weapons maintenance requires specialists, which will also be a big issue. Let's get back to our issue. The risk of international isolation also put pressure on that time's government. Leonid Kravchuk didn't join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in the first days of his term, but he eventually took this step. Another worthy mention is the visit of Bill Clinton, who stayed at Boryspil airport and had a conversation with Kravchuk at the airport, which was a clear sign of the cold relations between the USA and Ukraine. But what is interesting is that a 1994 US State Department document containing a conversation between Kravchuk and Clinton at Boryspil airport about Ukraine's nuclear disarmament has been declassified. Kravchuk complained about opponents who were hindering the process. We actually have nationalists who stand up to the president on nuclear weapons. There are few of them, but they should not be allowed to expand. They are ready for reckless actions. We are speculating on the situation and making it worse. In other words, Kravchuk himself was willingly adding fuel to the fire, which clearly didn't help improve relations between Ukraine and the USA, but rather frightened the Americans even more. Volodymyr Vasilenko mentions that in those days, the choice was between nuclear weapons and political commitment to Russia, along with the USA's negative attitude towards Ukraine. Though the situation was not at its best. Even in the 90s, when most Ukrainians considered Russians to be brothers, Russia was happy to play a dirty trick on Ukraine. This proves once again that Russians are tricky creatures. Russia rapidly and undisclosed removed tactical nuclear weapons from Ukraine to its territory in May 1992. What remained after that were strategic ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads aimed at the United States and other NATO countries, and strategic bombers aimed at missions overseas, according to experts. The last strategic nuclear weapon was withdrawn in June 1996. That's the kind of brotherly relationship we have. The decision was made by the General Staff of the Russian Ministry of Defense, and the whole procedure was carried out using the technology that had existed since Soviet times. Echelons arrived from Moscow, unloaded nuclear warheads from storage facilities and took them away. Kravchuk didn't even know that tactical nuclear weapons were being taken out, recalls Yuri Kostenko, who was Ukraine's nuclear disarmament negotiator until July 1993. Apparently, the West knew about these Russian maneuvers and clearly understood the possible consequences. One more quote. Indeed, the strategic nuclear weapons were under Russian control, and Russia took out tactical weapons before the 1st of June 1992 because they understood that we could keep and use tactical weapons, mentions Kostenko, who was also the Minister of Nuclear Safety. In the early 1990s, some problems with access and lack of information were also reflected in publications such as "A Second Chernobyl is Ripening in Ukraine's Nuclear Mines." Thus, doubts were being raised about the technical and safety status of those weapons. Needless to say, in the early 1990s, people were still very much aware of the Chernobyl disaster and were frightened by the possibility of a nuclear accident in the missile silos with warheads. As we now see, this problem is not so simple, and there were many reasons why Ukraine was forced to refuse from its nuclear arsenal. Let's also talk about compensation for rejecting nuclear weapons, if it can be called that, because there were some pitfalls here as well. True, Ukraine received compensation for its nuclear potential, about $980 million in fuel for nuclear power plants. And a part of Ukraine's gas debts to Russia was charged for the strategic nuclear bombers transferred to Russia. According to Kostenko, the cost of enriched uranium and plutonium in nuclear warheads only was worth thousands and thousands of billions of dollars, but Russia didn't make any compensatory concessions. Time was running out for Russia. The longer Ukraine delayed nuclear disarmament, the more problems it faced. But that was not the end of Ukraine's problems. We should also remind you that Ukraine was facing an energy crisis at that time. The so-called rolling blackouts were not uncommon in the early 1990s, when entire regions spent hours in the dark at certain periods of the day without electricity due to lack of it. Moreover, gas debts were growing and Moscow began to use gas as a political weapon against Ukraine, putting pressure on it, experts say. Kostenko also points out that people were not ready to live in even greater poverty for the sake of the country's power, especially since these were post-Soviet people, many of whom were even ready to vote for the communists. According to the very same Yuri Kostenko, we should have received higher compensation from Russia in addition to not transferring the weapons to it, but destroying and disposing the nuclear weapons on the territory of Ukraine. So only the shell was destroyed and we had no control over what happened to the highly enriched uranium and plutonium. I'm positive that those materials are now used in Russia's current nuclear weapons, Kostenko said. It would be advisable if nuclear materials from the weapons that were in Ukraine were processed into nuclear fuel for Ukrainian nuclear power plants, for a peaceful atom, not to increase aggression as Russia does. But here we have to take into account once again, for example, the West's fear of Russia's well-known trickery. To be completely honest, few people considered Ukraine to be completely independent back then. Actually, the entire world began to consider it independent only in 2014. After all, most of the world, including the West, believed that we are a state little of Russia, and ordinary Western citizens did not even make a difference between Ukrainians and Russians. Whose fault is this? Well, we think it's the Ukrainians themselves. Unfortunately, we failed to learn from the others' experience, but we did well to make our own mistakes. However, this is a completely different story. We would like to tell you about a little known but very curious fact. Harvard historian Serhiy Lohi revealed in one of his articles that after the defeat of communism in Poland, it issued an ultimatum to the USA in the early 1990s, either NATO membership or the creation of its own nuclear weapons to protect itself from Moscow. The journey towards nuclear-free Ukraine should have been completed when it became a member of both NATO and the EU, Kostenko says. Again, Ukraine was not trusted then, and the situation with Poland was different. There were also a few sentiments involved, as the West had betrayed Poland after the Second World War, leaving it to the Soviets. Thus, the United States wanted to establish relations with Poland by itself, and as we know, they have succeeded in doing so. We need Ukraine to do the same. It's time to talk about today's consequences, namely the Budapest Memorandum, where the USA and the UK, and ridiculously enough Russia, guaranteed Ukraine's security. But in 2014, Russia simply ignored this memorandum and annexed it, or in other words, stole Crimea. Otto von Bismarck once said, "An agreement with Russia isn't worth the paper it's written on." You'll agree this says a lot. And as for the United States, Obama and Putin were experiencing an overload of relations at that time. He really didn't want to mess up this relationship with Russia for the sake of Ukraine, urging Ukraine to calm down and saying that he would negotiate everything with Russia, that everything would be alright. He failed, he just turned a blind eye. As a result, the east of Ukraine was kindly. Now we would like to once again thank the entire civilized world for its support of Ukraine from the bottom of our hearts. It is in Ukraine's interest not to lose this support and finally become an essential part of the Western world. Please like, leave comments and help us promote this video. Let's see the world from the Ukrainian perspective.